Good evening and welcome. My name is Ed Kovacic Jr. and I serve as the current president of the Springfield Public Forum's Board of Directors. Tonight, it's my pleasure to announce the second virtual talk of our Fall 2020 speaker series, Election 2020, What's Next?, which features a conversation about the November 3rd national election with NPR senior political correspondent Domenico Montanaro and Weekend All Things Considered host Michel Martin. Please note that the raise hand and chat functions will not be available for tonight's talk, but we will be accepting questions via the Q&A button. Questions will be reviewed and sent to the moderator for consideration. Tonight's program is made possible through a partnership with New England Public Media. It's now my pleasure to introduce Maxie Jackson, Chief Content Officer at New England Public Media, to tell you more about tonight's panelists.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Not only am I the Chief Content Officer for New England Public Media, but I'm the newly appointed board member of the Springfield Public Forum. On behalf of both organizations, I'd like to welcome you to Election 2020, What's Next? We are grateful to the Springfield Public Forum for making it possible for us to bring you this virtual event tonight. And of course, to our guests, Michel Martin and Domenico Montanaro from NPR. As you know, New England Public Media has been reporting on this election season since, well, 2016. It's been an incredibly busy 4 years. And like you, I've turned to Morning Edition, All Things Considered, PBS NewsHour, and Frontline to help me make sense of it all. Here in Western New England, our own newsroom has been busy as well. Their award-winning reporting has kept our community informed, helping to explain ballot questions, covering local Senate races, and sharing conversations with first-time voters in our region. They have also covered the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial justice movement in our communities. This fall, our Connecting Point team has produced a weekly roundup of local politics and several digital exclusives. I'm excited to share that they are currently on hiatus, preparing for the launch of a newly imagined multi-platform experience that will debut on our television, radio, and web platforms beginning in January of 2021. I want to thank all of you who support our work. Your commitment to ensuring that your community has a public media presence is essential. We are proud to work alongside Mass Live and other news outlets in our region to keep you informed and inspired. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Kari and Njiiri. Kari is the longtime host and producer of Jazz Safari, local host of NPR's All Things Considered, and a senior reporter on New England Public Media, who covered election stories for New England Public Media and on election night. Kari?
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to introduce, in terms of a brief biography, our two participants, Domenico Montanaro and Michel Martin. You know their voices, but Domenico is NPR's senior political editor and correspondent. He joined NPR in 2015, overseeing coverage of the 2016 presidential campaign, including for broadcast and digital. Before coming to NPR, he served as the political director and senior producer at the PBS NewsHour. He was also deputy political editor at NBC News, where he covered 2 presidential elections and reported and edited for the network's political blog, First Read. He's also worked at CBS News, ABC News, the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey, and also taught high school English and coached soccer and basketball. Thank you, Domenico. And Emmy Award-winning veteran journalist Michel Martin is the weekend host of All Things Considered. She came to NPR in 2006 to launch and host Tell Me More, which was also broadcast on the NEPM News Network. Prior to that, she spent a decade as a correspondent for ABC News Nightline. She also worked for the written press, covering politics for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. You've also seen her as a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week and ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, as well as being a contributor to Now with Bill Moyers. Thank you again both for joining us this evening, virtually via Zoom, given the proverbial elephant in the room that is COVID-19. With that in mind, my first question involves what has informed your election coverage this year. but I thought it might be of interest to our audience to help understand what goes into preparing the news that they hear. If each of you could briefly describe your workday in preparing your coverage and how the pandemic has changed the way you do what you do, if any, if it has.
Well, I work on the Washington desk, which is a little different than what Michel does. And we're sort of covering all the breaking Washington news, every turn of the screw. We have every, correspondent covering different beats, Congress, Capitol Hill, White House, the Justice Department. And there's certainly been no shortage of news in any of those areas over the past 4 years. We have an entire political team too that we've staffed up, smaller than most other, commercial outlets, that's for sure. So we have to pick and choose the kinds of stories that we think are interesting and important and worthwhile for our audience to hear. So we go and follow the story. We're on, we were on impeachment, for example, for quite some time with multiple reporters. And then we have reporters who are out in the campaign field covering the Democratic primary at the exact same time. So, it takes a lot of juggling, a lot of sort of Rubik's Cube planning that I'm not as good at as some of my colleagues. Thank goodness they're the ones doing most of that. This cycle, I've been able to write some more analyses and kind of get in touch with some of the sources that I've known for some time, 15 years covering this, and be able to sort of give a big picture view of what's happening in the country and in these campaigns. And even then, we're still surprised. So, of course, COVID has changed a lot of what we do. We are not out in the field as much as we would have liked to have been. Travel has been severely limited, obviously. We're here talking on Zoom where we'd obviously rather be, in New England. We're probably a little past fall foliage, but, that could have been fun. Maybe next time. So, that's a lot of what we on the Washington desk do. It's been a breakneck pace. And because the president can't accept the outcome of the election is still continuing. So we are still covering things at a breakneck pace and now covering 2 administrations, essentially. So that's where we're at. We will turn a corner eventually on this and have one president. But for the next 60 some odd days, it appears we're going to have one and a shadow.
Well,
Michel.
what informs my coverage is Domenico.
And Michel, don't tell anybody because no one's listening, obviously, but you are my favorite person to be on with.
Absolutely. I would expect you to say nothing less. But it's true. Like I have a lot of respect for Domenico's judgment. I'll just have to say that sort of up front. And that is not the case with everybody who has sat in his chair, just to be really honest about it. Because I think that anybody who covers politics has done a lot of soul searching in recent years. I hope that that's the case. I think that that's the case. And I think that a lot of us have spent a lot of time thinking, did something go wrong in 2016? Okay. And if so, what? And the reason I pose it as a question instead of as a statement is that there are those who don't like the outcome of the 2016 elections. And therefore they say, oh, the media was wrong. Something was wrong because I don't like how it turned out and it has to be somebody's fault. Therefore, it's probably yours. I don't accept that, but I do think it's important for us to evaluate, like, what did we get something wrong? Were we shocked? Is there something we missed? And so I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time over the last couple of years thinking about, like, what was our technique and is there something that should have been improved? And so I mean it when I say that I depend a lot on Domenico's judgment, not just because he's covering sort of the granular story, but I also feel responsible to, particularly because I'm on the air primarily on the weekends, although I do obviously a lot of special coverage. This is my day off. You're welcome. But I just think that on the weekends, I think there's a slightly different pace. And I think that you have a responsibility to try to give people something a little different. I think that you have a responsibility to try to meet people where they are and where I think, obviously Saturdays and Sundays are work days for a lot of people. They are for me, but that's the world I grew up in. My dad was a firefighter and everybody else in my family was a cop, including the women, just throwing that in there. And so the idea that, Saturday and Sunday is somehow different for us, like, our Saturday and Sunday was whenever it was, right? Just like Thanksgiving was whenever everybody was off. So I'm mindful of the fact that some people are at work, but other people are trying to take a break. And so I'm trying to think, what do they need? What do they need to make sense of the week? What do they need to make sense of? Maybe they didn't have time to listen to or read 3 newspapers a day and watch 3 different news programs or watch 3 different cable channels to try to figure out what they think is true. So part of what I try to do is, I feel like you're in New England, so I can use a hockey metaphor, if that's okay. I try to figure out where the puck is going and get there, and meet it there, as opposed to just, well, this is what happened on Friday, Saturday, this is what happened today. So I'm going to just sort of regurgitate that. And then on Sunday, I try to give you a sense of what is to come. But also, as just Domenico said, how things have changed is that I try to be mindful, not just of what people are thinking, but how they are feeling. Okay. And I think the way a lot of people are feeling is bad. And so I try to balance in the program, not just, what I think people need to know, but what I can offer to help them feel better. And so that's why you'll find, and I know some people don't love this, but, in the same program that you may have, a hard-hitting story about, the latest kind of election scandal, or whatever, we may have a story about, like I had Ina Garten, the beautiful, celebrity chef and cookbook author, to talk about how you can make the most of this in these times, because I'm trying to sort of offer, I'm trying to be mindful of how people, as I said, feel, as well as what they need to know. And also, just like Domenico said, the travel. I think that, we, in 2018, during the midterms, we all fanned out, like all the hosts picked states, either picked states or were assigned states. We all fanned out. And, we spent as much time in those assigned states as we could, because we wanted to get the flavor of the country. It's just a lot harder to do. It's different having, like in 2018, for example, one of my states was Pennsylvania. And, I was in people's living rooms and they were offering me pumpkin roll. And, we were chatting about, why they liked, Trump, or why that was the pumpkin roll. Or in other places, we had a beautiful, like those of you who belong to sororities, will get the flavor. There were some lovely women who were part of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of voter outreach, voter education team for one of the big sororities. I'm not going to play favorites, so I'm not going to tell you which one. And of course, they had, completely as a surprise to us, they had put together, we'd asked if we could interview a couple of other people on their election team. And sure enough, they put out this beautiful spread of and we, of course, we didn't request it. Certainly we weren't expecting it, but that is the kind of thing that happens when you're out on the road. It's like a lot of people were like, oh, you're out here, come on over. And I'm missing that. Just like we're all missing, I think a lot of us are missing getting together with family. I don't know, Domenico, I'm sure you feel the same. I'm missing getting together with voters. I'm missing getting a chance to kind of look at their family pictures and, see what, just see how they live and what's informing their feelings and thoughts. Like one of the most interesting conversations, I had in the midterms was some Republican, activists, volunteers in central Pennsylvania who talked about 2 things that turned out to be very relevant in this election. They talked about their fears of socialism, because that idea was already taking hold, like, oh, they're trying to push socialism on us. And I'm like, where did that come from? And driving out of town, there was this billboard that somebody had put up as a troll to the Democratic governor, Tom Wolf, who's a businessman who is as far from a socialist as you can get, but putting up this sort of just to troll him. And they took it seriously. They didn't realize it was like a joke or sarcastic or just a diss. And you already saw that storyline developing there. And that just isn't something I would have known. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And and also some of the attack lines directed at, or even some of the things that they were claiming were part of their Trump's appeal to them. Like, this is an area where there were, like, I'll just say it, our reporting team increased the minority population by a factor of 3, and yet they were talking about how he had reached out to minorities, and I was like, huh? What? And it was all, what they were received messages. And I would not have known that that was something that was penetrating unless I had been there. So I'm still proud of the work that we all did. I'm very proud of the work that Domenico and his team did. I love covering this stuff, but I really did missed that pumpkin roll, and I really missed those visits with the voters.
Because of that COVID-19, it's harder to assess how people actually feel, I would imagine. Yeah,
it can be, and we obviously saw this time around that the polls were not 100% getting all of the Trump support. I mean, really, when we look at the issue with a lot of the polls that happened this time, it really was an underestimation of Trump support in especially Republican areas. So if you can't get out there and talk to people, and you're doing, 1,000, interviews on a survey, trying to hope that you can get some view into people, there's just such a disdain and such a disconnect between Trump supporters, the media, and polls that, there's a whole reckoning going on in the industry right now about why they underestimated Trump's support. Because if you look at Biden's top line number, he's going to wind up with 51% of the vote. He was at 51.8 in the average of the polls. That's pretty dead on. What was off was that Trump had an average of about 44% in the polls and didn't really rise much above, including in our poll, never went above 44% in our poll. And he's at 47% nationally. And, I always thought demographically, Michelle talks about our reporters increasing the diversity by a factor of 3 in some places, in the Midwest and in some of those old Rust Belt states, that all of them are majority whites without college degrees. I mean, anytime you have that's a core Trump base, and he can never be written off because of the way he has driven such a cultural wedge and taken kind of, in some respects, the worst instincts in people and made it okay. They have license to feel that their situation is somebody else's fault. And this grievance politics, white grievance politics, it's just what it is, is what he's used to drive that narrative, and has made it harder, frankly, for all of us to do our jobs in an objective way, including polls. And I think that it's a fascinating thing that we're going to have to deal with.
Well, but it's also, I think it's harder to do our jobs on a macro level, but on a micro level, I think you're still getting it. Like one of our reporters, I'm still thinking back to one of our reporters, Asma Khalid, who's currently, I don't know where she is physically, but she was election night. She's been with the Biden campaign. So she was in Delaware with the Biden campaign. But before that, she was traveling around as most of our reporters do. They kind of go back and forth because, as Domenico said, we do have a smaller team than, some of the other news organizations. And Asma was telling us, gosh, a year ago that, the Republicans are fired up. So she said the Republicans are fired up. This is their guy. Yeah. They love him.
I mean, I think one of the lessons of this year and of 2016, and I've been saying this for, some years, is that politics is an art. It's not an exact science. Data has a place, but it's not all of it. And, look, anecdotal voter interviews are not, scientific either, right? Yeah. Right. But they have a place in understanding feelings and intensity and what's going on. Hopefully when those things match up, they give us a better sense of everything. Like, for example, in the Democratic primary, we knew from polling that Democrats' number one priority was to beat Donald Trump. And we knew from our field reporting that Democrats' number one priority was to beat Donald Trump. And that sounds simple, but what it means is I dismissed a lot of the horse race polling on purpose because of that, because there was going to be volatility based on the news, based on who they thought was best situated to beat Donald Trump. So when you're not voting for somebody based on, your warm feelings toward them or their ideology or their policies, and you're voting because you're placing a bet on them, then everyone in the Democratic primary became a political pundit. And that's a weird place to be. It doesn't happen that often in politics, especially on the Democratic side, where they say Democrats like to fall in love and Republicans fall in line. But they were certainly doing it this time around, where they were trying to pick the person they thought had the best shot.
Kari, what else you got for us? Because he and I could go all day.
Yeah,
well, we could. But, well, you talked about the flawed polling. We talk about why is this not like Florida in 2020 years ago? And what kind of lessons?
Oh my gosh, you said 20 years ago, and I almost laughed.
Yeah,
like that was a joke. But that was
later.
Literally 20 years ago. Oh my God.
hard to believe, isn't it?
It really is hard to believe. This is not even close to Florida 2000. This is one person, the president of the United States, not able to accept a very clear outcome. I mean, the fact of the matter is, yes, some of these states are close percentage wise, but look, Pennsylvania, 72,000 vote margin currently. Georgia, 14,000, 12,000 vote margin at this point. Even Arizona, close state, 10,000 vote margin. Nebraska, Nevada, 30,000+ vote margin. Michigan, where nothing is going to get overturned, 146,000 vote margin. Wisconsin, where it's going to go to a recount because the president requested one, not because it's automatic, 20,000 vote margin. Between 2000 and 2015, Fair Vote did a study of all of the recounts and that have taken place in the country on a federal level. 27 recounts. The average vote margin change was 282 votes. Okay. I mean, this is not changing. Joe Biden is the president-elect, and he's going to be president of the United States, barring some, catastrophic, third world country style, thing that Democrats, of course, worry about with President Trump, that he could try to pull off. But, I think people ascribe way too much, strategic thinking to Donald Trump. There's no strategic thinking generally. It's all about.
You don't think there's a method to this?
There's no broader, there's no bigger plan. There's, how do I look on TV? How are people thinking about me? He wants everyone to like him, including the people he despises. Like the New York Times. There's nothing, listen, I'm from Queens. There's nothing someone from Queens wants more than to be accepted by Manhattan. Okay. And when you get over yourself and realize it doesn't matter, you finally can live like a healthy, mature adult life. But
this is where, because I'm from Brooklyn, and we all think we're our own country anyway.
Yeah.
So
Brooklyn's different. Brooklyn's different. Kings County, different, right?
Exactly. We just don't care. We don't care. Really.
Yeah. But
This is basically about dominating the news yet again.
Yeah.
Well, sure. Being the center of attention. Sure. I mean, I will tell you though that I do know, and I will say, I do believe that many people are deeply worried about what Domenico talked about. I mean, obviously it depends on, sadly, it shouldn't, but sadly, it seems to depend on what team you think you're on, right? And it's really, I think, from the standpoint of people who, Americans who grew up, believing in a rules-based international order with the US at the helm, establishing norms and expecting others to follow and supporting other countries in developing a stable middle class, a rules-based international order, a rules-based trading system, all the above is very disturbing and disheartening. Sadly, some people seem to be adhering to the notion that 10 beats 9. And as long as my guy or my team wins, then it doesn't really matter how they got there. But I will say that, maybe X million people believe that, but more people don't. And
I'll tell you, I do.
Let me just finish my thought, Domenico. I'm speaking. I'm speaking. The clearest indication of that, the clearest indication of that, I think, is that whole debacle at Lafayette Square, where, the president, assembled all these, this sort of group of forces from, with the assistance of the Attorney General, from the Bureau of Prisons and the National Guard, from places where he had friendly governors who were willing to send people to support this effort so they could clear the Lafayette Square of protesters who at that point were mainly, singing, beating drums and breakdancing. That's the truth. And, and kind of to tear gas them and pepper spray them to sort of clear it so he could get that photo up. I mean, the clearest example of that there are other people who have other values and adhere to other norms is the fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff went out and spoke to all of the troops the next day to say, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have been there. And I think that is an indication and a signal that people still take their oath to the Constitution seriously and are loyal to the Constitution and to the country and not to a regime.
I had a question for you regarding Trump's statements and actions. Given that he is the outgoing president, do you feel more free to talk about the way he does what he does, the supposed falsehoods? I mean, I don't think there's ever been a time when there's been more fact checking his statements on a daily basis, and some will just say outright lies. Does it make it easier to talk about him in that way now that he's on his way out?
I don't know. I mean, I think that sometimes we've taken too soft of an edge with what we know is to be the truth. I do think that we ramped up our fact checking in 2015 and 2016, seeing this kind of thing, and the audience responded. I mean, some of our biggest trafficked digital stories were fact checks, live fact checks. We do these live annotations of the debates. I mean, look, my dad used to say what's fair isn't always equal, right? And, you can't just do equal, both sides treatment. That's false equivalency, right? I mean, this president of the United States says more things that are factually untrue than any president who's ever been president and has been, fact checked to see how many. I mean, the Washington Post has got him at like tens of thousands of lies or tens of thousands of misstatements, falsehoods, misleading. I mean, just listening to him through the coronavirus pandemic, there's so much there that's just factually wrong. And we've said repeatedly, these things, we've tried to cut through the noise. I think the problem really is that we're segmented, we're siloed in this information war where, you have the president of the United States sort of trying to take out from under us the credibility of being, nonpartisan, fact-based journalists when people there's so much confirmation bias that's going on where people believe something, they are told they're wrong, and they find a link that will tell them they're right. That's really messed up. I mean, we can't live in a society that's fact-based. We're talking about New York. I used to listen all the time to like 660 sports radio, and my family is Italian family. Everyone's getting into arguments all the time, and you know what? Your feelings didn't matter if you were wrong. It just didn't. If you got proved wrong, you could be as passionate as you want. You needed to be humble and step away, right? You were wrong. So now shut your mouth, right? That was kind of the attitude. And now it's like everybody's opinion matters. I don't know, I grew up thinking if you're right, your opinion matters. But if you're wrong, maybe go learn something, and that's just not the way it is now.
And yet he managed to garner 70 million votes.
73.
More than 70, more than any other candidate.
Kari, I
in
want to go
US
back to your question
with the
about
exception of Joe Biden.
Easier. I just want to go back to your question of, is it easier or not to call the president out on his falsehoods? I approach it, first of all, I need people to understand this was never a personal and individual decision about whether to call it falsehoods, lies, misspoke, mistruths, whatever. Those were, from our standpoint, those were always decisions that were arrived at with consultation with management, and they had institutional imperatives and points of view that those are, we have a standards and practices department. There's an involvement of, management in making these decisions. I don't consider that censorship. I call it editing. And I think that is part of that is the reality of being in an institution. And I accept that, because my feeling is, if you want to be a Lone Ranger and do Lone Ranger things and make your own individual decisions, fine, but then be responsible for keeping the lights on and the money and the paper and the printer and all this other thing. The only reason I raise that is that there were lively debates about this for years. Domenico, you agree with me, for years, about what to call these falsehoods. And the reality of it is, it's not that President Trump's, the fact that he's going out is what changed the language. It's just that people came to a consensus about what would best serve the audience. And I just want people to understand that. It's not that somebody said, NPR told us we couldn't say that. There were lively discussions throughout this presidency about what best serves the audience. And I'm just telling you, from my standpoint, some of the editorial decisions that I make as the host of this program, people don't agree with, but my attitude comes down to what best serves the audience at this time. And for me, calling the president a liar is like calling an alcoholic an alcoholic. When is he ever going to agree that he is one? So right. I feel that it is more useful to say, well, you had 3 drinks last night, your speech was slurred, you were stumbling down the block, and we had to take your keys. You draw your own conclusion.
And what are the consequences?
That's how I feel.
What are the consequences of those actions, especially
right? That's how I feel.
If you're the most powerful person on the planet. The other thing that we have had lots of lively discussions about with that is, I think the thing that we've come back to repeatedly is describing the actions, describing the words. And we've also done a lot of work on trying to not give credence to things that are false, because there's this weird psychology that, when you write what the falsehood is first and then you combat it, that people actually believe the falsehood, even if you combat it. So they have this kind of sandwich theory of where you sort of state the truth, state the falsehood, and then restate the truth. And, look, I don't know if it works or doesn't, but I think it's important to constantly try to find better ways to reach out to audiences, to get them to see factual information without necessarily dismissing you because you're the messenger and it's who it's coming from.
Can I just move off to another part that both of you have alluded to? This election challenged a lot of assumptions about the tendencies of certain blocks of voters to support one party or another. What does that tell us for the future of both parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, and how can each party capitalize?
Can you be more specific? Because I feel like you're kind of talking around what you really want to know, Kari. So why don't you just go right there. Just say it.
In terms, well, given...
You want to know about the Kanye factor.
No, I'm not sure that I want to talk about the Kanye.
Okay, go ahead.
But if you want to talk about the Kanye effect.
No, go ahead.
Well, I guess it also involves the terms that we use to describe certain folks: conservative, liberal, progressive, moderate, in describing voters and or policies. I'm
with you on that. That's always bothered me. I'm just saying, as a person, not let me just establish here that I'm obviously who I am, right? And I don't like people making assumptions about what I think based on what this face is, okay? And I've never liked it. And I also have felt that many times the language that we use to describe particular groups just doesn't resonate with me, like the term conservative or liberal. If you look at African Americans traditionally as a voting group, just as a voting group, okay? African Americans tend to have a basket of issues, that some of which are conservative and some of which are quote unquote liberal. Like, you will find that African Americans tend to believe in a stronger federal government footprint on certain programs. They tend to believe that the federal government should play a more active role in ensuring fairness and opportunity. Many African Americans support the death penalty. Many African Americans oppose abortion, but the difference is abortion on demand, as it were. The difference is that they don't necessarily choose those as voting issues. It's not the higher priority for them, right? As it is for other people who share those views. And I'm often really irritated and disappointed when people sort of lump everybody all together. Like I remember asking, I won't call his name just because, you know, I'm just not gonna, a prominent white evangelical leader who is very close to President Trump. And I asked him, why do you think it is that African Americans who share the same faith commitments that you do don't vote the way you do? And he said, oh, it's because they get money from the government. Okay, here we go, okay. Like, I guess white people don't get Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, agricultural subsidies, you know, here we go. So I guess what I'm saying is I yearn for a more sophisticated language to discuss these issues. And I look forward to the day when we can figure out how to talk about these issues in a way that feels more true to the people being talked about, including me. And I also, you know, and I feel that's true for a lot of people, not just people of color. Like I just talked to John Tester, the senator from Montana, a couple of days. I've talked to him a lot lately. He had a new book out, and you know, so we're BFFs now. And so, you know, he's the last Democrat standing in Montana. You know, but Montana is like the Republican. Montana's been voting for Republican governors for 20 years. But they've also had a Democrat in the state house as governor for the last 16. And so what happened there? And he, you know, he's another, like he calls it a kind of a rural urban divide. That's how he experiences it. He's also like a 4th generation rancher. And I just got to, I want to tell him, I have told him, he doesn't believe me. I said, you're not the only one. So it just, we have a need as journalists to sort of aggregate things just in a way to talk about them. But that doesn't mean it's comfortable, right, nuanced, or accurate. Domenico, I think you want to jump in here. What did you want to say about that?
I don't know. I mean, what did we start off talking about? Labels, right?
Yeah.
And I do think the thing I love about being a journalist is understanding that people come from different backgrounds and people are products of their upbringing. And why I think like we're so awesome in the media is because we're pretty open-minded about the fact that people are all different, you know, and that just because you grew up a certain way doesn't make your way the right way, or I grew up a certain way doesn't make that the right way either. I think what's important for us as journalists to try to maintain a degree of neutrality and you know, dedication to the truth, which is I think more important than neutrality, is on making your own biases conscious. You know, you say what they are, you understand where you come from, and then you make a good faith effort to understand those who think differently than you do. We all have personal opinions, but you know, that's what editors are for when it comes to journalism. And, you know, I mean, like I'm the son of a union teacher who's, you know, kind of a lunch pail Democrat, you know, and so I understand that, right? I understand that's where I come from. Very different than one of my first real, you know, network reporting assignments, which was covering the 2008 Republican primary in South Carolina. I mean, you take a kid from Queens and put them in South Carolina for the Republican primary. And you know what? It was one of the best experiences of my life. I just thought it was so great. People were so open. They're welcoming. They tell you exactly what they think, you know, and you really get a sense and an understanding without judgment of what's, you know, maybe who they'll vote for, what's important to them, what drives their family, you know, issues. And look, if you have enough people who agree with you, you can run a country, right? And I do think earlier Michelle was talking about, you know, sort of majority rules, I think. And I do think we're headed more toward a majority rules strictly by the numbers. If you have enough people who agree, then you can get stuff done. And if you don't have majorities, we won't. Because I have an analysis coming out tomorrow, actually, about looking at the counties in the country and how things have shifted. And what I found really fascinating about that is how hardened we've become. There were only 77 counties in this election that changed hands. There were 206 that Obama won twice, that Trump won in 2016. There's not this, the New York Times did this great map in 2008 from 2004 showing the margin change. And almost every county in the country, except for a few in Oklahoma, had become more Democratic. There were trends that people sort of moved in a direction. That didn't mean they all voted Democratic, but the margins shifted toward Barack Obama. That didn't happen this time. And Joe Biden is going to get more than 80 million votes. Donald Trump is going to get the second highest amount of votes ever at 74 million probably. And what do we have? There's no consensus as to what the governing mandate is. There isn't one. You have two parties very strongly in favor of their own ideas, their own beliefs, and where compromise is a dirty word. And I'm not 100% certain how that plays out, looking at the forest instead of just the trees over the next 20 years.
I'll just give you one example of that. Like 82% of registered voters who supported Biden said in October that the coronavirus outbreak would be very important to their vote. Only 24% of registered voters who support Trump said the same. And before the election, most Republicans said the pandemic had been exaggerated. Yeah. So that gives you just a sense of even something that you think, wow, this is right in front of your eyes. And I'm not saying on the question of whether or not the president did all he could, which obviously Democrats don't agree with, or whether anybody could have foreseen this, which Democrats say, obviously you could have because they did, and so forth. But just on the fact of, is this serious? The fact that at this point in this crisis, in October, when these numbers were taken, this is from Pew, tells you that, like Domenico said, we are not living in the same reality set.
If I may, just to pick up on one of the points that Domenico mentioned, and you, Michel, the high turnout, it also led to the election of the first woman as a vice president and a record number of women in Congress. Might we see a different brand of politics being played out going forward? I mean, you're talking about the lack of compromise. There was a general assumption that women politicians, globally speaking, generally tend to be a little bit more adept at compromise than their male counterparts.
I would highly doubt that. I highly doubt that. I'm just saying that, sure, perhaps it depends on what the parameters were that they were running under. Like, I'll just say that, a couple of other races have been called since I last looked this up, but I think 8 of the 10 people who flipped seats were women. 8 of the 10 people who flipped seats that flipped House Democratic seats that flipped were women. Okay, so Republican women, I think, are approaching their historical presence in the House. But one of those women is a QAnon supporter who supports this insane theory that I don't even want to say it because it's so ridiculous, but that this whole theory about, pedophiles and that Trump is here to, it's an insane conspiracy theory that is beyond a theory. It's it's a movement, let's say a conspiracy-based movement. And she's a supporter of that. So she's already made a name for herself when the newly elected lawmakers came to the Capitol to get their briefing, their orientation, what they call the don't go to jail briefing. Basically telling them how to, she was complaining about having to wear masks and encouraging her compatriots not to wear masks, which, so no, I don't see it because the incentives are all to hew to that line. And I think that those realities will, and you know why? Because women are human beings. And they respond to the same incentives that men do. Now, in the Senate, it has been a different story. In the Senate, that you see, like Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, have, shown more of a willingness than others of their party to compromise. The relationships are stronger, I think, in the Senate, or at least they have been. But at the end of the day, I think people respond to the incentives that are in front of them, and the incentives in the current environment are not to compromise. What do you say, Domenico?
I think that Michelle hit a nail on the head when it comes to what you need to, how to view the way politicians think. And that is whatever that incentivization is. And for them, the incentive is to win. There's nothing else. Like people want to, put morality onto them, just cause. None of it matters. Like if they are going to lose in their district by backing a thing that maybe even a majority of the country wants, they won't do it. And we've seen it time and time again, and it's just gotten more hardened. It's not rewarded by the electorate to compromise. It's not rewarded by the electorate to find common ground. What is rewarded is to fight to get what your people in your district want. I mean, this is, a representative majority, representative democracy. And when some of these people are representative, they are representative of their districts. And, you have a lot of, people on one end of the spectrum or the other, because it's a very big country. And we have just seen polarization, spread further and further apart. And we've seen what is rewarded, and it's not working with the other side.
Well, I think the only reason, and that's one reason why I think you see more in the Senate, because at least you have you have longer terms, so people can forget that they're mad at you depending on when your tough vote came, and B, you have more of an opportunity to put together a winning coalition than you have in a House race. But I think
a state.
If you look at the this is where I'm going to throw in a plug for my Obama interview. Shamelessly kind of slipping into this conversation.
I was going to ask that about that too.
Well, yeah, I talked to the former president on Friday. The interview dropped yesterday across, sort of platforms. And in his book, I will just say that in his book, A Promised Land, he talks about all the people who took tough votes and Democrats who took tough votes and then lost seats, and his sort of and his regret about that. Like Claire McCaskill being one, the Missouri senator who's now a commentator for MSNBC, but she took a tough vote on, immigration reform, and he didn't think he said right up to the minute he thought she was going to vote against it, and he called her the next day to thank her and said why. She just said, I couldn't look those kids in the face. But she did lose her seat. So I guess what I'm saying is that, anyway, the answer to your question, Kari, is nope.
The other thing, and I was going to plug Michelle's Barack Obama interview also, and one of the reasons is because in his book he talks about the moment during his I think it may have been his 2010 or 2009 address to Congress, where Joe Wilson, the congressman from South Carolina, yelled out, "You lie," when talking about immigration. That was a line that was seen as a massive line to cross. And guess what happened? He saw fundraising go through the roof, and he became a conservative star. When that kind of behavior is rewarded, guess what people are going to do?
Except that then he switched, though. Then he became a Trump critic. So that's kind of an interesting, weird. Anyway, go ahead, Kari. We're going
given
off
the, and I'm going to go
you
to
see, we spent a lot of time together because we're like, Domenico,
I'm going to get some questions from the audience, but I did want to ask, given that, in terms of what the Biden administration can accomplish going forward, given this polarization, given that we still don't know what the outcome of the Senate composition will be, what do you think a Biden administration can accomplish?
Well, can I just say that, again, I asked the former president his thoughts about this, and I got the sense that he kind of walked right up to the line of saying that, because I asked him, I said, a lot of progressives, a lot of Democrats feel that that's a fool's errand. I mean, your idea of like this reach of this bipartisanship, and I'm trying to flip the Trump voters. He says a lot of progressives think that's a fool's errand. That's not how it is. How it is you get your base, you fire up the base, you keep it fired up, you try to take it all. That's the only way you get anything done. And what he said, he thinks it's better for the country. What Obama said is he thinks it's better for the country to make that attempt. But I think, but he said, look, people are writing all these pieces about, Mitch McConnell, the current Senate Majority Leader, and Joe Biden's long friendship. And he basically was like, nah. You know, I mean, he didn't say that, but he was like, nah. So
I mean, think about the thing that
I mean,
Joe Biden had to win was like raising the debt ceiling. This is like, you know, not exactly, healthcare, the healthcare bill, or passing Social Security, or the Voting Rights Act. I mean, it's so small bore, but that's what it took. And I don't know that there's a lot that he can accomplish legislatively in a very big way. I do think that there's at least some bipartisan effort for another coronavirus relief package. I think you'll see something like that probably pass, if not in the lame duck, very early on in the Biden administration. And of course, I think Biden is going to roll back a lot of those environmental regulations that Trump rolled back from Obama. You're going to see rollbacks of the rollbacks. And I think we're going to be sort of in this constant back and forth on with each party. One, the Democratic Party talking about climate change, what to do about it, and the Republican Party rather to talk about energy and what it would cost to go in a different direction. And I don't see anything breaking that logjam. I mean, there was some bipartisan consensus on climate change in like 1988 and like nothing got done about it. So, where we are now, I think it's going to be difficult. I think Democrats are already looking at 2022 because they have a more favorable Senate landscape. If they don't pick up these 2 seats in Georgia, where then Republicans would still control the chamber. And even if Democrats do pick up the 2 seats and control it with a 50-50, Senate, where Kamala Harris has to come in and break ties for every piece of legislation, Democrats would have to take a very, very big and controversial step to get through some big legislation, which would be getting rid of the filibuster for legislative, action. And that, I think, would change how this country does business. But let's be honest, the country itself has already changed the way it does business, because instead of using the filibuster as an incentive for compromise, they're using the filibuster as a way to block the other side. And Mitch McConnell has done that to a greater extent than any prior leader in history.
The only other thing I want to say is I want to ask people to keep your eyes on Stacey Abrams, because I think that she has been a proponent of, in a way that is, I think, very logical, is very inclusive. She's not a hater. Like how in the church we have this expression, fiery mad and then fiery glad. There's people who are fiery mad, like they're mad all the time. Why are you mad all the time? And then there's people who are fired up, but they're fiery glad. And she has a sense of evangelism around voter outreach and turnout. And you see the results in Georgia, where Georgia has, Democrats are competitive in these statewide races for the first time in years. And I think that people correctly credit her efforts in that regard. She lost the governor's race to Brian Kemp, or at least she says, her side says it was stolen through sort of voter suppression efforts. But my point is simply that she has articulated again in a way that few have in recent years, the need to go up and down the ballot, to not just focus on executive races, but to focus. And now it has to be said, Republicans increased their share of state legislatures this year. This is something that we are not talking a very great deal about, that they control more state legislatures, both houses, than at any time in US history, okay? They don't reach the level that Democrats did back in the 50s, but they are in the 30s, like 32. And I think that's significant. But what I am saying is that she has sort of reinvigorated the argument around the sort of the down ballot. And I just think that that's worth paying attention to. And it is also my plug for, I want to just give a plug to local news. I think that one of the great tragedies of the current era is the demise and the sort of the withering on the vine of local news. And I just feel like we don't talk enough about just how important it is in terms of we as citizens understanding each other, communicating with each other, knowing who each other is. And I just think that that's, if I could just give that plug to that, because it's how people learn how to be citizens. Okay. Yeah. And I just think that's a big deal. Go ahead.
I need to get to some questions. Hold on,
Okay, Kari.
Domenico. I need to get to some questions from our audience before we
Oh, sure.
close out here, because we can talk all night along about
I
this.
know, we're terrible. We're sorry.
From Scott, he wants to find out what has been the most surprising thing or trend that you saw on the trail, aside from COVID-19. Anything that particularly surprised you?
You know, to be honest, I feel like everything I saw is what I expected. You know, there's such strong partisan identification. I think Michelle was talking about wearing the T-shirt. And, you know, someone else I know who works at another news outlet likes to say that partisan ID is a hell of a drug. And it's really where things have come down to. I think I've been somewhat surprised by how much, I guess, Trump's bad behavior is excused by people who vote for him just because they originally liked him and they wanted to send a message to Washington. And it's very hard for people to get out of, you know, when you've dedicated yourself to something, to then objectively look at something and say, that's not the right way to handle something. And, you know, there's just been so many instances where he's done something that's, you know, more out there, and his base, there's no shaking them from their fundamental belief that he is the right person for the job. And even if they don't agree with his tweets, which is always like the cover thing where they'll say, you know, yeah, I don't like his tweets, but I like his policies. You know, it's a cultural division and a direction that people want the country to go in.
I mean, I am surprised that the handling of the COVID crisis has not had greater repercussions for the people who were in charge. And I'm not surprised that, I'll just say it, the president's racism was not, and, you know, racist dog whistling is not more, my own reading of history, my own life experience, sadly, doesn't surprise me. But I do feel that when people's own ox is gored, it tends to get their attention. And I perhaps just, you know, it hasn't been seen as serious enough in communities where people are willing to hold people accountable for the conduct of it. I mean, it's fascinating to me that, you know, I had an interview the other day where I raised this issue and the woman got very defensive. And, you know, I'm not going to, you know, those of you who heard my Saturday show know what I'm talking about, got very defensive. And I thought, like, wow, that's deep. It's almost like you're saying, gee, I'm going to applaud people who, you know, helped people whose boat sunk, but I'm not going to ask why that boat sunk to begin with. Okay. And I just find it, you know, I'm going to applaud that rescue effort, but I'm not going to ask any questions. And I'm going to be irritated when somebody asks questions. Why did that boat sink to begin with? Was it the design of the boat or was it the captain of the ship? And that part surprised me, I have to be honest, just because I feel people are primarily, I mean, this isn't cynical, just to say people are primarily interested in what affects them. But at this point, this affects everybody. And I'm just surprised that it doesn't have more consequences, because I think that there is no other area of, you know, the guy who ran that ocean liner into the pier in Italy, you know, some years ago, faced charges. And he saved himself. Like, he saved himself, contrary to the maritime law, rather than save people on his ship. And he's got to face charges for that. And so I'm just curious why. I'm not saying people should be criminally prosecuted. That's another whole conversation. But what I am saying is it surprises me that people don't take their own government more seriously, to think that people should be accountable for the job that they signed up to do. That's surprising to me.
From your experiences, from the perspectives of looking in, what has been the most powerful movement, with the exception of our right to vote, have you witnessed from communities fighting for change? Some of the question from an audience member.
With the exception of the right to vote. Well, I will say that I think, like a lot of people, I have been very interested, intrigued, you know, at times moved, at times disturbed by the way that the Black Lives Matter movement has gone global. And it's been quite fascinating. And the reason I say moved sometimes and disturbed at other times is that, like all of, you know, movements that take to the street, sometimes people behave in ways that are not honorable. I mean, or they become a cover for other people to behave less than honorably, okay? But it's been fascinating to see this go global. And it's also been fascinating to see how many people who are not directly affected by police violence against people of color have been moved to join these movements. And I just have to feel like there's something really profound about that. I mean, I'm saying, and not to sort of highlight him, but to see Senator Mitt Romney of Utah go down to what is now Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. with his church community. And people asked him, like, why are you here? And he said, because Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think that's just a remarkable thing.
Yeah.
And so I find it very, it's just a remarkable thing to me. I think it's always, as I said, I think that the way of the world is that we are most interested in that which affects us. That's most people. So when you go to a point of disaccommodating yourself, even putting yourself in some risk in some ways, to stand in solidarity with people whose journey is not yours, whose suffering is not yours, and to join your suffering to theirs, or to at least witness that, I think that's very profound.
You know, I agree on a lot of that. I think what's interesting about the question about, aside from the right to vote, so many of these movements, whether it's women's suffrage, whether it's the civil rights movement, have been about that most basic right to just go vote, to just be able to express, you know, your given right, where a lot of people were crossed out of that at the signing of the Constitution. And that has been so much of the push and the effort. It always starts with the fundamental basic right in this country of a citizen to be able to vote. I've always been a little taken with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The fact that, Reconstruction happened, there were so many compromises, including in the election of 1876, where they essentially decided, where the election was decided by one electoral college vote. And they had to create a bargain where they essentially punted down the road Black rights in the South and gave more rights to essentially white supremacists to stop African Americans from being able to open businesses or be able to vote, and then so for that's another 90 years later. You fast forward to 1966, and you're right in the middle of the civil rights movement, and we're still. And I just think it's fascinating. I was always kind of obsessed with the relationship between LBJ and Martin Luther King Jr. because yes, there was a political aspect to that. He needed Black support, but Martin Luther King was so just savvy in the way that he knew how to protest that wouldn't offend whites, which I think is interesting for that time period. And he knew that if he was going to get the attention and go to Washington, what's my agenda? And he was able to come up with stuff that would benefit the Black community, not everything, but having a civil rights, agenda pass. It's a very big deal. And it makes me wonder, fast forwarding to today, LBJ is the kind of person who could take something like that and apply it and gather the kind of numbers necessary. I mean, let's be frank here. He wouldn't have done it if he weren't a Southern white Democrat, wouldn't have been able to do it. And how does that play out today when, there is this racial reckoning going on? Where do the policies get created? I don't know if it's happening in Washington.
I just want to say there is no social justice movement that has not offended someone. So that just isn't, you know what I'm saying? I don't care how well dressed you are. I don't care how many, beautifully tailored suits and dresses and pearls and gloves you wear and pumps and whatever. There is no such social justice movement in this country that didn't offend someone. So that to me is not, the standard. It just,
yeah, but I guess my point is that so many, especially first in, with African Americans in baseball as a president, as a civil rights leader, almost had to be better than other people, which I find to be a fascinating thing. Where Jackie Robinson sort of had to turn the other cheek. There was this idea that there are going to be people offended, but you got to walk this line. That other
Barack
people
Obama.
just haven't had to deal with. Absolutely. Absolutely.
We're about to close up, but another question was, what recent Trump firing of an official has concerned you the most?
Oof. Well, tonight's firing
is that
concerns me the most, where Chris Krebs, who was essentially responsible for securing this election, refused to say that he that there was anything untoward about the election, that the votes were counted properly, that he ran a rumor control operation where he was taking myths and disposing. This was a Trump appointee who was doing his job, who did his job well. This office was created by the Trump administration, and the president of the United States, like so many other things, creates another unforced error for himself where he could have been able to embrace someone like this and say, look at the success that I'm partially responsible for. And instead, because of his own pettiness, fires the guy because he's speaking truth and won't say that there's a fraud, widespread fraud going on in the country. And I guess the thing that continues to surprise me is how many people are willing to sell themselves out to say things that they know are completely untrue just because they don't want to offend President Trump.
From your
I
reporting,
continue to be impressed. I just want to say I continue to be impressed by people who, I agree with Domenico completely, but I continue to be impressed by people who continue to do their jobs with integrity despite that. And they have my, I just think that, we thank people who wear the uniform of the United States, and appropriately so. But I think we need to thank people. You shouldn't have to thank people for doing your job with integrity, but I continue to be impressed with the courage of these individuals. It shouldn't take courage when so many others are not. And for Chris Krebs to stand up and do his job according to his oath and his sense of right is quite remarkable in the current context.
From your reporting, do you know or assume that there will be a Biden press secretary who will have quote unquote normal press briefings on a scheduled or traditional base?
I don't know. Let's hope so. I mean, it's hard to even think about what that's going to look like. But look, I would welcome the times when we can get back to pressing an administration to hold a daily briefing and stick to the facts and tell us where the policies are going to be coming from and going, and what the facts are, and we're not debating what the facts are, but we're debating policies, and we're pushing them to be transparent and open with us, and by proxy for the American people. So I certainly hope so. And if they don't, we'll be there to push them.
Well, I just want to point out that, I cover the George H.W. Bush administration, Bush 41, and I think people forget that there was not a daily televised briefing. There was not. There was a daily briefing. It was not televised. There was a spray, what we call a spray, at the top of the briefing where, cameras could get pictures of, and if the president spoke, of course, and if there was somebody, like a cabinet member who was doing something, truly noteworthy, you'd photograph it. But for the most part, it was not photographed. The Clinton administration started photographing them because they thought it would help them, right? They thought it was helpful. They thought that kind of back and forth and stuff would be to their benefit. So frankly, I didn't miss these briefings, which were, in the current administration, that were basically an opportunity to abuse people, to verbally abuse people, and to say things that are untrue. And so the reinstitution of these briefings, I don't think has been to the benefit of the public, because it's basically been a propaganda arm of people to say things that are, blatantly false, and to use our colleagues as foils to, in an unprofessional and an abusive fashion, to advance a partisan agenda. And so, so my point is that I don't need to hear from them every day unless they have something to say. I don't need to see them every day unless they have something to say. And I think that, what form that takes should follow the purpose, right? Form should follow function.
How do we
not the other way around.
All right. How do we reconcile when both parties are in their own information bubbles, and where is the common ground going to emerge? Any idea?
Public media is going to fix it. Fix this. Public media.
Who's ready for infrastructure week?
There you go.
I mean, obviously,
they can never agree.
in one way or another, I think we both expressed our profound concern about that fact. I mean, I think we both in different ways expressed our concern about it. And, you know, obviously, you know, I think it's interesting, like one of the papers, I forget was the Post of the Times, did a piece just the other day about how sort of Trump supporters say, oh, they want healing now, I'm not doing it, you know, that kind of thing. So it's, I think this is really a challenge both of leadership and of character, because this is the situation where I think truly people need to take the high road for the betterment of the country, even if the payoff isn't immediate, you know. And I think that from an information transmission standpoint, I think that these big tech companies have a very great deal to account for. That's a whole other subject, which I encourage you to take up as in another forum, because there are plenty of people to talk about this that I think would be very, but I also think that this is one of the things that, even though we get a lot of pushback sometimes from the audience that would like us to be something other than what we are, this is one of the reasons that we continue to try to play it straight, so that people can, that everyone can feel welcome here, and that everyone can at least feel that we're trying to do right by them. I mean, unfortunately, some people's concept of doing right by them means agreeing with them and validating them even when they're saying things that are blatantly false. And we just can't do that. That's our ethical obligation. But I think it's our job to continue to try to be for everyone to the degree that we can. And I think that's what we're going to do.
Domenico, I wanted to touch on something that has not been really spoken about here because we're dealing with the election, but a post-election and going forward into this new administration, the role of foreign policy. I mean, we've just heard the news that the Trump administration, the Pentagon, is reducing the number of troops in the Middle East, and yet there's talk about ramping up actions against Iran, for example. How does this present a problem for the incoming administration?
Well, I mean, you know, if you were to create a whole new, you know, essentially, you know, a military action like that, and then you leave, well, then the next administration has to sort of clean that up and continue it. And I think we're seeing a particularly difficult situation in this case because, you know, the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, is not getting the daily intelligence briefings to see what's actually happening. Joe Biden made a joke the other day that his VP-elect is on the intelligence committee and she's getting briefings and he's not. So maybe she can tell him what's going on, or maybe she can't because it's classified.
How about you, Michelle? You have any thoughts in terms of challenges that the Biden administration is going to be facing on a global level?
Oh gosh.
What should we be concerned about?
Oh gosh.
No pressure.
No, I'm trying to figure, because we're closing this out and I'm trying to leave this on a positive note. I think that the biggest threat is always the thing that you don't know. And I know that when former President Obama left office, he said to, and this is not new news, that he said to incoming President Trump that his biggest foreign policy challenge was going to be North Korea. And the president's inattention to this is truly alarming. And I also see a deterioration of engagement in countries around the world that had been making progress, like just in the recent days, that, you know, in Ethiopia and Eritrea, they're, firing rockets to each other. And they had just opened the border between these two countries, literally within the last 2 years, after sort of years of diplomatic effort. And so I guess I am just concerned about the fraying of, as I said, a commitment to a rules-based international order that has been occurring and accelerating over the last 4 years, as well as we see sort of the rise of these kind of populist movements in Europe. You've seen a bit of a firewall there in Europe. I mean, you've seen some sort of a rejection of those policies, but you've also seen sort of an embrace of them. I just think that there's just a tremendous amount of work to do. And the American people's appetite for doing that work seems to be at a very low point. but it has to be done. It doesn't go away just because it's almost like it's raining outside, but because you've turned your face away from the window, you think you're not going to get wet if you go out there. Guess what, you are. And so the chaos and the sort of the lack of commitment to, and what's sort of just surprising to me about it is that this sort of turning away from multilateralism just means more work for you. You know what I mean? It's like you've decided, I'm not interested in that. Well, it also means that there's nobody else doing it. There's a vacuum. And, we know who's filling that vacuum. In some cases, Russia's filling that vacuum. In other cases, China's filling that vacuum. And I just think that, there's a lot to keep people up at night. There is a lot to keep people up at night. But I also believe that it's been encouraging to see the way there has been some sort of international cooperation on addressing this health crisis, which affects basically most countries in the world right now. And I think that that's a sign that you can work together, that there should be, you see my point? I think success builds upon success. And if there's an appreciation for the fact that global cooperation addresses this health crisis, maybe that creates more of an appetite. Does that make sense for further cooperation, because people can see a success?
Sure. One last question for each one of you, and that is your next project. I understand, Michel, you have an interview with the Surgeon General coming up.
No, Saturday. You misspoke because you
I'm sorry.
Carefully. You listened to every minute of the show. I know you did. So, yeah.
Well, besides that, and of course the president, what other interview do you have coming up, and what's on your horizon, Domenico? I'll start with Michel, please.
Oh, well, I am, okay, this is like COVID mom life. This is life right now. I had arranged actually to take this weekend off because I haven't had a day off in a couple of weeks, and just going from elections to then Obama and this, and I actually traded my working Thanksgiving. I agreed to work Thanksgiving so I could have this weekend off because my son was playing in a soccer tournament, and I just got an email today that they're not allowing spectators.
Wow.
So, because they're trying to get the tournament played in because they've canceled so many games. I'm not whining. I'm just saying this is like mom life in COVID, in the era of COVID. So I don't know what my next project is. I think I think we're going to try to squeeze in some more kind of cultural pieces that we haven't had a chance to kind of get to, just because we've had so much other stuff going on. I'm hoping to have an interview with a certain Oscar-winning director who has a really interesting project that's coming. So hopefully that comes through. So I'm hopeful that there will be some sort of order to the political news so that we can bring you some of the other things that we know kind of brings joy to your soul. So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you, Domenico?
I'm still sort of stuck in the middle of vote counting. I'm eagerly watching, and I've created a spreadsheet with an Excel formula to tell us about how much Joe Biden and Donald Trump will finish with based on the current and outstanding vote. So I'm still sort of, can't let it go at this point. And it looks like Biden will get above 80 million votes and win the popular vote by more than 6 million, or about 6 million, which is quite something. Both candidates getting super high numbers. And then it's going to be, I guess at some point, thinking about and transitioning to, the Biden first 100 days. But before all of that, the thing that I'm watching next week, and I can't believe this thing is actually going to still take place. I don't understand it, but the turkey pardon is happening probably again at the White House. If you want to know all about it, every year I post the same history of turkey pardons, not because I think these are fun or funny or a good idea, but because I think they're super weird. And I don't know why. Well, I do now know why they started. And, they're going to take place again. And, presidents were always given them to be eaten. And that's probably what should still happen. Just my opinion.
Kari, that's like nerd fun. Like that is like such an NPR stereotype. I'm almost embarrassed. Domenico, you're embarrassing me. Like,
Well, I'll be tuning in, that's for sure. Michel Martin and Domenico Montanaro, thank you so much. I
No,
could
you're
be
welcome.
asking more questions through the night, and we can be talking politics, whatever you want to call it, all night long. But really, thank you for your insights. Thanks to my colleagues here at New England Public Media, as well as the Springfield Public Forum for setting up this evening's program in this challenging time. I guess one final thing would be to say, given the pandemic, given these challenging times, at least we can say that there was greater public participation in the vote this year than any other year. And that has to be good for democracy.
As long as you accept the results.
Whatever the results may be, that the people actually went to the votes in spite of COVID-19.
Yeah.
And we hope that this turnout will be more than just once every 4 years, that we become as engaged through the next 4 years as we were this election season. Thanks again to Michel and Domenico, and thanks to all of you that sat in and watched on Zoom. I'm Kari and Njiiri. Thank you for joining me, and please, wear that mask. Wear that mask. Take care, stay safe, and good night.
Good night. Good night.